So you want to reality shift. I would ask you, where are you going and why? Because when we're not careful, if we try to shift away from our burgeoning life path too soon, if we try to go and run away from ourselves in particular, what we find is that we just shift into another reality layer or dimension with slightly different narratives, maybe even different people or groups or organizations involved, but the theme is actually the same. And this was one of my big aha moments when I was doing reality shifting, because I, for a very long time, was in a nightmare reality. And so I was like, I gotta GTFO out of here. This is like, it's scary. And I started shifting, and then I just ended up in a different version of a different nightmare. And after about 5 of those, I was like, wait a second, there's something going on, right? I was like, that's when I really started thinking that everything was a simulation. And I remember having some other sensory experiences where it was like I was in a VR world, and then I heard this podcast of Elon Musk talking about us being in a VR simulation, and I was like, oh my God, I got to talk to him. And then later I found out that this is my hypothesis, reality is much more fluid, and it's not just one thing. Although he may be in one where it is a simulation, I've actually seen that there are simulations and then there are others, quote unquote, real worlds. And there's actually a whole host of options to choose from. But if you're not careful, the closest options that are going to be designated to you, I like to think of it like a frequency field. Like, imagine you as the lotus of a rainbow, and you have in your auric field all of these different colors, and those colors, or those bands of colors or wavelengths, represent different realities that can attach to you, and vice versa. And so let's say you start off in the green band. It's most easy to shift to the blue than it is to shift to a vastly different color or an opposite complementary color, right? I'm imagining it like a circle, like a rainbow surrounding you, but you're in the center. And your vision looking outward is where you're operating from and how realities are attaching to you, and you're attaching to them. And so the ones that are behind you are in opposition. And so you'd have to do a 180-degree turn to attach to one of those. And you can do that, but it's really challenging. And so it's a lot easier to just slightly shift to the right or slightly shift to the left. And in doing so, you notice that the color gradients are a little bit different, but they're congruent, they make sense. And so you can go back and forth between a couple of different similar colors, but to get to a completely different one, you have to make a pretty big jump. And then you also have to make sure that all of the colors surrounding you in the entire circle are not based on the same theme. Because then, no matter where you jump to, the theme is going to be the same, even if there are vastly different colors, people, organizations. It's like the underlying dynamic is fundamentally the same until you address that problem. If there's a problem. And very often there is, because in my experience, people don't do enough shadow work. And I've met numerous people who are quote unquote conscious, evolved, incredibly intelligent human beings, and they haven't done the work. Not really. And also the work is ongoing. It starts off in a subsection of your psychology, and then it spirals upwards. And you get a chance to see the lessons from different viewpoints. And ultimately, as you start to master them and come out of the lessons, you have little mini challenges that the universe will send you. I just recently went through some of those to really make sure that you're not just learning things intellectually and theoretically, that you're actually practicing them. And so when you start shifting realities, you can get confused because if you haven't done any shadow work, then it's just going to be a fucking mess. Literally. And I know some people that are in a mess that are just jumping around and in all versions of nightmares, kind of like I was for a while. For me, my theme, all of the colors that were attaching to me, was related to victimhood, which rooted all the way back to childhood wounds, which I believe is very important to recognize. Because, for example, I'm a mother and I have a little baby. If you don't know, you probably do, because I mention her a lot. But what I found interesting is that we spend every day, all day together, and have for a while, and I have the luxury of being able to do my work with her by my side, which makes some of my client calls a little interesting, except for my psychedelic ceremonies. Those I can't do that with. But anyway, so when I have left her, a couple times that I had left her, she was not a newborn. This is like several months into our journey together. And I left her with people that she was familiar with. And the first time I left her, it was with somebody who was staying with us for a while, that we would see them every single day, hang out with them all day. And so it was like a customary thing that she got to know this other person. And I stepped out for an hour, and just being gone that long created dysregulation in her nervous system. Like I could feel it in her body. She was so panicked and so stressed, and it had nothing to do with the person that was staying with her. And then this pattern would repeat with other situations until finally she became acclimated and she started to learn that I was coming back. But I was really surprised because I left her when she was well fed, well slept, and where she wouldn't have needed anything, right? But the sheer fact that I was gone, and that paired with her limited cognition of, just being 5 months old, is maybe 4 or 5 months. I can't remember exactly the first time, but it's around then. You'd expect that at that time, there wouldn't be object permanence, meaning that she wouldn't know that I was really gone, but she did. So either the scientific papers are outdated, or I have a super smart baby, or both. I'm not really sure, but I know other parents who have noticed that this idea of object permanence starting in 8 months is definitely inaccurate, leading me to believe that we are evolving as a species. And I talk about this in Are We Preparing for a Revolution series more in depth. And I talk about this specific example, and then talk about how the people who set up our societies then, relatively speaking, were less evolved and less intelligent. So no wonder everything's collapsing, right? And anyway, so what surprised me is that I, as a caregiver, had zero control or influence over her trauma wound that I created. And this was a big aha moment for me, because now imagine that I was dropping her off to daycare every day, or that I had a job outside of the home. Then this would build and build and build. And thankfully, it's only been a couple of times, and I've been able to work around it and to comfort her as best as possible. But it was really, really challenging. Like the first mushroom ceremony that I did, I was gone for like 6 hours, and I came back and she was reasonably okay, but she couldn't sleep and she didn't eat the entire time I was gone. And it's one of those trade-offs of, well, I have to. And I understand that she doesn't understand, but I can't go into her cognition and tell her that her experience is invalid. It's one of those things that has to coexist with the reality of me being a single parent, right? But now let's extrapolate this, because this is real trauma, and nervous system dysregulation is a real phenomenon that people carry throughout their entire lives. Now imagine that she starts to grow up and I'm not able to work by her side. And imagine that she starts to create a story about who she is and the feelings that she has related to me trying to provide for us, and me trying to continue friendships and going out and taking care of myself. And imagine her feelings of abandonment or rejection getting spun into a psychological narrative that then she carries all the way into adulthood, that she needs to go and see a therapist for. And so this would be an unconscious pattern, because as we talked about in one of the previous segments in the series, this is the time that these patterns are being laid down, and you went through the exact same process. And so based on your limited cognition at a very early age and your experiences with your caregivers, you have created narratives that have permeated through your adult relationships. And hopefully those are healthy and healed, but a lot of us are struggling with feeling fearful or anxious or worried about abandonment or rejection. And so as a result, shifting realities isn't going to solve anything, because all you're going to do is just get a reconfiguration of the same pattern, because the pattern itself is emanating from your unconscious mind, which is why it is imperative to spend some time making the unconscious conscious and doing the shadow work to illuminate what your patterns are and to find out what your theme is. And the best way to do that is to look at your breakups, or to look at the tension points in your work relationships or your familial relationships, because these are often the vehicles that we can analyze these patterns. Our closest relationships are usually where we feel the most comfortable letting our shadow freak flag fly. And that's when you see the worst behavior in people. It's just how we're built as a society. I'm not sure why this is. It's kind of counterintuitive. Like, the closer we get to people, we think that the better we should be treated. And with people who still have shadow work to do, the opposite is true. I don't like to speak in dualistic terms, but this has definitely been my experience. It's like, oh, we're really great friends until you come and stay with me, and then you treat me like what? It's like, come on, like, what's going on? Oh, we're really close and we're really compatible until we fall in love, and then it's like, then you're acting like a fucking crazy person. Like, what's going on? And all because I didn't remind you to grab your stuff. Okay. Like, what's going on here? It's kind of strange. And so when you have done the work, you realize that your perspective changes, and then the rainbow colors that surround you change. And then as a result, the realities that you are able to shift into have a different theme behind them. But the process to do that is not an easy, quick thing, because the process of self-mastery and the process of making the unconscious conscious is a time-bound process where you have to demonstrate to yourself that you really have mastered that leg of the journey. And that means you have to pull in and magnetize people who will give you those lessons in a different form. And usually when you're backing out of the pattern, it's a lighter form of the lesson. It's just like, it's almost like an annoyance because you're like, I thought I was done with that. Oh, it's coming up again. Okay, but it's coming up in a like, not in a life or death sort of way, but in just kind of like, okay, I get it. I see it. Let's take care of it and let's move on. And then you have this sense of freedom because you're like, wow, I really have grown. And then you look back at your life and you're like, wow, I can't believe I stayed as long as I did in certain relationships once you see everything, right, from that vantage point. And so for a while, all of my colors in the rainbow were me being a victim. Everything was happening to me. And it was a result of my powerlessness and fear of using my voice, fear of standing up for myself, fear of saying what I needed. And so I had to go back all the way through into the root of it, which happened in childhood, where I was the oldest, and I had a textbook, I guess, abusive, neglectful childhood, where at one point in my school, my parents were being investigated by CPS for the marks on my body. And when I was 6 months old, my mom left me with the cleaning lady of her workplace and didn't come back for months until my grandmother figured it out and then came and took me. But the cleaning lady, thank God, she had a daughter who was like 10 years old. Her name was Sherry, took me in like her baby. And she could only care for me when she wasn't in school. And so she would care for me after she got off the bus, and she treated me like I was her little daughter, but she was only 10 years old. Right now, I'm looking at my little baby, and I just can't imagine leaving her with anybody for months on end and just abandoning her, right? And so now you start to understand where this rooted story that I had was that dominated my fucked up relationships for a very long time. I mean, I was a mess. I was a mess in my 20s. I met a wonderful man. We got married, and bless his heart, he gave me a great relationship. He was such a great partner. Was it perfect? No. We had our issues, right? But we went to couples counseling together. I did the personal work. I was dedicated to the personal work. I learned how to speak my needs. I didn't always do it, and I didn't always do it constructively. I would often shut down. I would run away. I would, act out in these kind of ridiculous ways. Now I can look back and laugh at it. And he also did the personal work. So we were both committed to the journey of growing together. And we did for many years until we reached a point where we couldn't grow together anymore. And that experience was great, but I still had more work to do, which is why I drew to me somebody who was like the complete opposite after we divorced. And I was thrown back into a relationship where I felt like I didn't have power and that I was scared to use my voice. And then I started manifesting some nightmare situations for myself that I had to pray to get out of. And it was really scary. It was actually terrifying. And all of the themes were the same, which is that I was being crushed under this oppressive influence. And the person behind the influence just so happened to change names and motivations. But it was like, it was a rodeo show of them. Literally, I could I could hear and sense the differences of the people. I would see different cars. I would, as the narratives would shift and the realities would shift, everything would shift with it, but the core theme would remain the same. And so until I found my power, until I found my voice, until I started really doing that level of the work, It was just a recapitulation over and over and over again. I called them destiny killers. And so I share this with you to also let you know that for a very long time, I hated my parents, and I thought I'll never go to their funeral. And something happened where I stopped seeing something wrong with me, and I started seeing them clearly, that my mom had me when she was 20 years old. My biological father was a Vietnam vet that was drinking himself to death and had some serious emotional things going on. And although he wasn't stationed in Vietnam, he was stationed somewhere else. Apparently, like, he wasn't exposed to Agent Orange. It wasn't like that, but it's not like he came back okay, right? And it's not like he was okay. And as a result, he was just a very disturbed person, and my mom was trying to love him. And after I was born, she walked in on him cheating on her, and she lost it. She just lost it. At the time that she was most vulnerable, the time that she needed him the most, he was gone. Emotionally checked out and otherwise. And so she broke. She was a escapee from horrible upbringing. She ran to him, and there wasn't a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow, because she was in her own pattern. And she couldn't handle it. She didn't have the skills for it. She didn't have the emotional tools in her toolbox. And I understand why, after seeing some parts of her upbringing and understanding her better as a human being, not as an authority figure, but as a human being. And then putting myself in her shoes. It was such a perspective shift for me that it opened up the doors to healing, for me to realize, like, wow, I couldn't have done it any better. I'm so grateful that I had my little one, when I'm so much more mature, because if I had her when I was 20, I would have been worse, I don't know how it would have been worse, but I was just not equipped at all. I was just a train wreck of a person. And so I congratulate my mom for having the strength to move through life the way that she did. And she did eventually remarry, and they're still married. They've been married so long. And he's a great dad, a great stepdad. I think of him like a father. So what's even more remarkable is that our healing journey together has continued, and now her and I are really close. And it's like this story that I held on to for so long, of her being a villain, has completely disappeared. It's just non-existent. There's just love and forgiveness and understanding. And that doesn't mean that she's a perfect person, right? Or that I'm a perfect person for her. Sometimes we go through periods where we're not vibing together, and then I ask for space, or she'll ask for space, and we honor that, and we respect that, and then we grow apart for a while. And it's a beautiful experience, actually. And so I say that to say that part of the reality shifting experience is working through your wounds, whatever they are, if you have them. And if you don't have them, you're amazing. And you're like a miracle of a human. And I have a lot of respect for you. Can we be friends? Like, I need more people like you in my life. So by understanding your unconscious mind and your interpretations, and by resolving some of those childhood wounds, if you have any, by seeing the people in your life as other humans, not as them doing something to you personally, then you can shift the colors and the themes of your life. But until then, you're just going to be in the same loop. It literally is kind of like a loop. And you're going to see it from different perspectives. And like I said, the people are going to change, the names are going to change, the organizations are going to change. But until you change and until that unconscious element of yourself is worked on, and I do offer this as a big part of the coaching, the reality shifting coaching, because it's so important. I mean, it's just mandatory, right? Because otherwise you're just you're gonna waste the opportunity. And I can be really direct. I'm not a therapist, so it's not a good fit for everybody, because we work on like breakneck speed to get you past some of the roadblocks that you might have in your psychology. And it's hard. A lot of people get triggered, and when they get triggered, they usually take a break. One of the people that I worked with, we made it 4 days 4 days before they were triggered. But I mean, those were like an intensive 4 days. It was like we talked a lot. So it was like probably 3 weeks of conversation crunched into 4 days. So anyway, it's part of the journey to be triggered, because then you can illuminate what your unconscious patterns are. But your reaction to being triggered is what is most important. So if you run, if you hide, if you get aggressive, then we have to take a break. Anyway, so we'll keep talking about this, but if you're interested in coaching, if you feel especially that you have some shadow work to do to help your reality shifting, or if you just want to work with the shadow work journey, I can definitely help you with that. It's a requirement as part of reality shifting. So as part of the screening process, we go through your psyche and determine whether or not you have any roadblocks of the shadow work nature that would prevent you from reality shifting to your dreams, or would facilitate you going into another nightmare. So we work through all that. If you come to me for reality shifting coaching, you can email me at sacredjourneyproductions@gmail.com. Okay, we'll talk soon.